and this is part 2. We're in Psych 400, Chapter 16 of the Psych 400 course pack, Chapter 16, Structural Equation Modeling, Path Analysis with Manifest Variables. We are going to resume at page 6 is where we left off, the section headed Details, Details, Details. If you're not already there, go to page 6. To refresh your memory, let's go back and look at our path model. We're going to perform path analysis to see if there's support for this path model developed by Dr. O'Day. She's trying to identify the variables that determine exercise sessions. Based on review of previous research and theory, she's developed a model in which exercise sessions is directly determined by health motivation and dislike of exercise. Health motivation is determined by a desire to be thin and current health. Dislike of exercise is determined by current health and a lack of time for exercise. And in my last video, I had left off at page 6, so we will resume there. Page 6, the section headed Details, Details, Details. Can path analysis prove cause and effect relationships? If you took Psych 299 from me, you know that we try to never use the word prove in statistics and research. So that's your first red flag that the answer is probably going to be no. Can path analysis prove cause and effect relationships? No, it cannot. When path analysis is complete, the results may provide support for the researcher's theoretical causal model. If the results are consistent with a hypothesized model, this means that the researcher's theoretical model has survived an attempt at disconfirmation. This would be good news for the researcher, since most readers will agree that such an outcome is supportive of the researcher's theoretical model, but few statisticians would conclude that such results prove that the theoretical model is correct. Here's one of the most important reasons that we should use caution when interpreting results from a path analysis. Even if Dr. O'Day's model provided a good fit to the data, it almost certainly would not be the only theoretical path model that could provide such a good fit. What do you mean by that? Well, if we go back to our theoretical path model, which was on page 4, this was Dr. O'Day's theoretical path model. Let's imagine she analyzes data, gets a good fit to the data. That's good news, but it's possible that somebody could rearrange some of these variables, make health motivation the ultimate consequent variable, make exercise sessions an antecedent variable, and still get a good fit to the data. It's not like every model fits, but it is usually possible to rearrange the variables in different ways and still get a good fit to the data. And that's among the reasons that anytime we do path analysis, we have to interpret the results with caution. Even if you get supportive results, it doesn't mean you've proven that your path model was correct. So we were on page 6, Details, Details, Details. Let's go to page 7 and continue. Page 7, a little ways down, the section headed The Theoretical Models to be Compared. When performing path analysis, it's generally considered best practice to compare 2 or more competing causal models. Models that differ in terms of their complexity, the number of causal paths included, or in other ways. In some cases, it's possible to directly compare the models in terms of their fit to the data. This section describes 3 alternative models that Dr. O'Day will compare in her analyses. The 3 alternative models. In the introduction section of our article, Dr. O'Day summarized relevant research literature presented 3 alternative models to be investigated. An excerpt from her article appears below. It says, one purpose of this study was to compare 3 alternative models of the determinants of exercise behavior. Figure 16.2 presents a composite that illustrates these 3 alternative models. On page 8, we have this composite path model. We will refer to this model from time to time. Let's scroll down a little bit so we can see at least part of the caption. Figure 16.2, composite model illustrating the 3 models to be compared. Notice it is essentially the same path model that I showed earlier, except now I've added a couple of lines to it. I've added this dashed line, and I've also added this dotted line. Adding the dashed line is going to create one alternative model. Adding the dotted line is going to create yet another. Let's see what Dr. O'Day says about these models. Model 1 is the least complex of the three models being compared. It consists of the causal paths represented by arrows with solid lines. If we look at this figure that's in figure 16.2, if you kind of squint and disregard this dashed line and disregard the dotted line, what remains is the model that has solid line arrows like this arrow and this arrow. That was the model that I presented near the beginning of the chapter. That is going to be model 1. Pretend there is no dashed line, pretend there is no dotted line, and you have model 1. What about model 2? Model 2 is the second theoretical model to be investigated. Model 2 is identical to Model 1, except Model 2 includes an additional path represented by the dashed line arrow in the figure. So, if you look at figure 1, the figure that has the solid line arrows, and you add to it this arrow, this dashed line arrow, now you have Model 2. Model 2 is identical to Model 1, except Model 2 claims that there's a direct effect of lack of time for exercise on exercise sessions. A little bit later we'll talk about the difference between direct effects and indirect effects. So that's Model 2. What is Model 3? Finally, Model 3 is identical to Model 2, except Model 3 includes an additional path represented by the dotted line arrow. Going back to our composite model, start with Model 2, the model that has the solid line arrows. Model 2 also has this dashed line arrow. If you add to it this dotted line arrow from dislike of exercise to health motivation, now you have Model 3. Model 3 is the most complex of the three models. Model 3 is the model that has all of these causal arrows that you see in the figure. I continue to page 9. Basic terms and concepts. We're still learning the lingo of path analysis. Basic terms and concepts on page 9. First up, what is an endogenous variable? In path analysis, an endogenous variable is a variable that's causally determined by the other variables in the model. Here's the key. If a variable has a straight single-headed arrow pointing at it, it is an endogenous variable. Let me say that again. If a variable has a straight single-headed arrow pointing at it, it is an endogenous variable. In figure 16.2, the three endogenous variables were exercise sessions, health motivation, and dislike of exercise. Let's see if that's true. Going back to figure 16.2. Okay, exercise sessions has at least one straight single-headed arrow pointing at it. That makes it an endogenous variable. Health motivation has at least one straight single-headed arrow pointing at it. That makes it endogenous. Dislike of exercise also has a straight single-headed arrow pointing at it. That makes it an endogenous variable. Notice desire to be thin does not have a straight single-headed arrow pointing at it, so it must not be endogenous. There must be another name that we use for variables like desire to be thin. Let's see what the chapter says. Going back to page 9, a little bit lower on page 9, talks about exogenous variables. In path analysis, an exogenous variable is a variable that is not causally determined by the other variables in the model. If a variable does not have any straight single-headed arrows pointing at it, it is an exogenous variable. In figure 16.2, the exogenous variables are desire to be thin, current health, lack of time for exercise. Is that true? Yes. Desire to be thin does not have any single straight-headed or straight single-headed arrows pointing at it. That makes it exogenous. Same thing is true for current health. Same thing is true for lack of time for exercise. Now we know what our exogenous variables are. Going back to page 9, we've defined endogenous variable and exogenous variable. I'm at the bottom of page 9, or closer to the bottom of page 9. Curved, double-headed arrows. A curved double-headed arrow represents a simple correlation between two variables. If two variables are joined by a curved arrow, it means the model acknowledges there might be a correlation between these variables, but the model does not attempt to explain the causal relationship, if any, between them. Do we have any curved two-headed arrows? We do. There's a curved two-headed arrow that attaches desire to be thin to current health. That means we acknowledge there might be a correlation between these two variables, but we're not trying to explain why the variables are correlated. In the same way, all three of our exogenous variables are connected by these curved two-headed arrows, meaning we acknowledge they're all probably correlated with one another. Curved two-headed arrows. We continue to page 10. Page 10 near the top. Straight single-headed arrows and direct effects. A straight single-headed arrow represents the model's prediction that the antecedent variable, where the arrow begins, has a direct effect on the consequent variable, where the arrow ends. The direct effect of an antecedent variable on a consequent variable is that part of the effect that's not mediated by another variable. This business of not being mediated, we'll have more to say about it later. Right now, let's just focus on this. Straight single-headed arrows represent direct effects of one variable on another. That brings us to the concept of path coefficients, a super important concept in path analysis. The term path coefficient can be defined in a number of different ways. In simple terms, it's a number that indicates the size of the direct effect of one variable on another variable. When path analysis is performed using multiple regression, and yes, you can do path analysis with multiple regression. When path analysis is performed using multiple regression, path coefficients are essentially multiple regression coefficients. Continuing, path coefficients can be in raw score form or they can be in standardized form. When a path coefficient is standardized, it's interpreted the same way that a beta weight from multiple regression is interpreted. It represents the amount of change in a consequent variable in standard deviations that's associated with one standard deviation increase in the antecedent variable, while statistically controlling for the remaining antecedent variables. I hope that sounds familiar. That's the same definition that we gave for beta weight back in the chapter on multiple regression. Continuing, under typical circumstances, standardized path coefficients will range in size from negative 1.0 through 0 through positive 1.0, just like beta weights in multiple regression. Residual terms for endogenous variables. In a path model, a residual term, sometimes called error term or disturbance term, is typically represented by the symbol E for error or the symbol D for disturbance. Separate residual term is estimated for each endogenous variable in the model. The residual term for a given variable represents the variance in that variable that's not accounted for by the other variables included in the model. It represents causal effects on the endogenous variable due to antecedent variables that have been left out of the model, to random shocks, or to specification errors. This concept residual term, let's go back to our figure that illustrates the path model. And yes, we have residual terms. We have a little E pointed at exercise sessions. That acknowledges that we don't expect all of the variance in exercise sessions to be accounted for by health, motivation, dislike of exercise, lack of time for exercise. We know that some of the variance won't be accounted for, and that is represented by the error term for exercise sessions. If a variable is an endogenous variable, there will be a little error term pointing at it. So we see it for exercise sessions and for health motivation and for dislike of exercise, but exogenous variables do not have error terms, as you can see. So that brought us to page 11. We're about to begin the section Initial Theoretical Model versus Final Preferred Model, and I'll pick up that section with my next video. This is a good place for us to end part 2.